He wrote it in a narrow slant of pencil, on a scrap of paper folded and hidden beneath his blanket, an astonished sentence that would have seemed treasonous back home. The light above him in the barracks hummed as if it too were curious. Outside, the Texas wind moved the long grass. Inside, electric bulbs burned at a steady, indifferent brightness, more light than most of his hometown had seen in months. On June 4, 1943, somewhere in Mexia, a captured German soldier put down 3 words that would mark the beginning of a longer, quieter surrender. They are not poor. That 3-word admission was not a political pamphlet or an enemy broadcast. It was a private, stunned observation written by a man whose identity the archival file does not clearly preserve. The paper is labeled simply as a PO diary, June 1943, Mexia, Texas. It is one of hundreds of similar fragments kept in American camp files, short notes, scratched nameplates, and brief letters home that together form a complex picture of what thousands of captured Germans discovered when the Atlantic crossing ended and the American interior began to reveal itself. The shock contained in those lines is the subject of this film. What German POWs discovered about America's unmatched industrial power, and how those discoveries, experienced firsthand, did something that speeches and leaflets could not. This is a story of jarring sensory contrasts: the first warm shower after months of cold, the taste of white bread that seemed obscene in its softness, the sight of factories that never slept. It is also a story told in numbers: thousands of prisoners, hundreds of camps, thousands of factories and ships, and production figures that, when lined up, make an argument few Wehrmacht veterans had been prepared to hear. When historians tally the flows of men during World War II, the figures are almost numbing. According to wartime U.S. Army records, more than 370,000 Axis prisoners, largely German, passed through the American camp system. They were not all teenagers or raw recruits. Many were seasoned soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and officers who had fought across Europe and North Africa. They arrived expecting an enemy reduced by blockade, scarcity, and exhaustion. Instead, they found organization, provision, and, most disorienting of all, abundance. The game of expectations began long before the prisoners reached the Texas trees. In North Africa, where many were first processed, the contrast was already forming. Men captured near Oran and other landing points underwent a quiet, surprisingly efficient bureaucracy. In the shade of canvas tents and concrete holding pens, medics checked their arms and legs, inoculated where necessary, and recorded simple facts: name, rank, date, and place of capture. Camp records show systematic medical screenings and immediate attempts to prevent outbreaks of disease that might spread in crowded transport. Men who had been trained to see enemy strength in lines of tanks and concentrations of troops were confronted with a different metric: assembly lines, factories, and the steady procession of goods. Arrival at a major port would, for many, crystallize the dissonance. Norfolk Naval Base, one of the largest and busiest naval stations on the East Coast, was the first American harbor many prisoners saw. For soldiers whose imaginations had been fed by newsreel frames of ruined ports and blockade-choked harbors, Norfolk looked less like a repaired asset than an industrial theater in full operation. Dockyards bristled with cranes, piers were stacked with lumber and crates. Merchant ships rode low in the water, laden. Garage lots were filled with automobiles, hundreds, then thousands, whose presence spoke of civic normalcy as much as consumer abundance. It is difficult to convey in a single statistic what a place like Norfolk meant to a man who had known shortages. Yet the archival photographs from the period and the diary fragments that accompany them show lines of crates, stacks of canned goods, and the steady rotation of supplies that kept fleets moving. Prisoners noted the size of the cranes, the scope of the warehouses, the long belts into which cargo moved as if by invisible hands. Confronted with such scale, many described an odd private conclusion: the war could not be waged on the back of starvation alone. From the port, prisoners were transferred to trains. Pullman cars and troop transports that moved inland through a landscape almost purpose-built to astonish. The train ride across the United States became another chapter in the informal education many prisoners were to receive. Nighttime scenes recounted in dozens of accounts often produce the most striking image. Towns at dusk, not darkened and shuttered, but lit. Streets and homes glowing, gas stations open, diners filling. Electric light was not a single novelty, but a chorus. Factories with windows shining, private houses with lamps burning, a constellation of productivity stretching across states. To a veteran of blackout conditions where every light could be a target and every window a liability, this steady luminance looked like evidence of a system that could spare electricity for millions of mundane uses. The conveniences of electric cookers, radios, public lighting, and industrial motors. One prisoner, noting this pattern in a brief camp testimony, wrote that the American countryside at night looked as if someone had plugged in the entire nation. Daylight offered another set of revelations. From the train, the prisoners watched landscapes that bore little resemblance to the battle-scarred fields of Europe. Instead of bombed-out factories and ruined railheads, there were single-purpose plants with long roofs and smokestacks, their lines precise. There were orchards whose neat rows seemed to suggest a scale of agricultural planning unheard of in the villages from which many prisoners had come. There were grain elevators, tall, clean, moving conveyor belts of grain, and the machines that turned harvest into commodity with a speed German fields could not match. Each vignette collected by the prisoners became material for comparison. They had been taught to see scarcity and to equate economic scarcity with moral decline. The American interior, as revealed in that train window, offered a challenge to a worldview that had associated modernity with decadence. For the men watching, the question was no longer merely, can this nation fight, but how can it produce so much and still feed itself? The pause between arrival and assignment was not long. Prisoners were processed at receiving centers, given identification tags, and assigned to camps according to labor needs. Records from the War Department show a system intent on harnessing idle manpower. Camps were sited near industries and farms where seasonal peaks in labor demanded extra hands. The official line was pragmatic. Use the prisoners' labor in non-combatant roles, agriculture, manufacturing, infrastructure, while observing the Geneva Conventions. But the consequence, unintended and profound, was that many prisoners found themselves working at the heart of American productivity, side by side with American civilian supervisors and, occasionally, local laborers. Before men ever set foot on a factory floor in Pennsylvania or a farm in Iowa, their first impressions were formed by the route itself. The never-ending supply train, the branches of power lines stretching like arteries, the roadside advertisements that seemed not only commercial but civic. The geography of American production was not hidden in a single city. It unfolded across the continent. It is important here to temper the anecdotal with archival anchors. Many prisoners wrote in their diaries about nights of illumination, the size of docks, and the unexpected availability of food. Yet these are not universal truths for every captured soldier. Records indicate a range of experiences. Some prisoners were transferred quickly to isolated camps and saw little of urban production. Others had longer periods of transit and greater exposure. What makes the cumulative evidence persuasive, however, is the repetition of similar reactions across different camps and transport routes. The pattern is not anecdote alone, it is recurrence. By the time a prisoner stepped off a train in a place like Texas or Ohio, he had already been on the receiving end of an orchestrated display of American capacity. Ports, trains, lights, and a seemingly inexhaustible supply chain. The small, private moments, bitten bread tasted in secrecy, a first hot shower, the crumpled newspaper announcing production milestones began to stack atop one another in memory. Where ideology had planted certainties, sensory evidence now planted doubt. That doubt at first was cognitive. How could the propaganda of the Reich, which had spoken of an enemy hollowed out by blockade and internal dissent, coexist with line upon line of evidence to the contrary? The answer for many prisoners began to unfold not as a conceptual debate, but as a series of lived experiences that contradicted training, speeches, and the lessons of the barracks. The softest of these experiences, the unexpected courtesy at a reception center, the availability of a second helping at a mess, was often enough to start the reinterpretation. A German sergeant, in a short typed debriefing recorded by camp authorities, admitted that he had expected humiliation, but found instead a measured, businesslike manner in his captors. An unnamed diary from a ship crossing described American troops on leave sharing cigarettes and food as if generosity were a currency freely spent. These small acts were not only kind, they were pedagogical. They taught by doing. And yet, there was another teaching that arrived with more clamor: the factories. From the port, many trains dipped into industrial heartlands where production had been perfected into a rhythm. Men who had been trained to respect the quiet precision of German manufacturing, workers who had known discipline in plants and yards, were confronted with a kind of mass production that differed more in scale and organization than in quality. The Willow Run plant, Ford's sprawling bomber assembly plant outside Detroit, would later be described by many visitors as a cathedral of mass production. Miles of conveyors, synchronized teams, and the conversion of raw metal into aircraft at speeds that seemed obscene to eyes accustomed to longer, more artisanal processes. At Willow Run, an assembly line could roll out an aircraft frame in days rather than weeks. To suggest that one machine or one plant converted minds would be to oversimplify. But the repeated exposure, river of output, night shift lights, the presence of women and minority workers in the workforce functioned cumulatively. PO diaries often returned to the same astonishment: a machine's relentless appetite for parts, the speed of cranes, and the hum of electric motors. These were not abstractions. They operated in the world of touch and smell. The smell of hot metal and oil, the taste of the first American sandwich after a long march, all of it registered as evidence that the enemy's capacity was not merely military but economic and social. As the ships docked and trains entered American stations, the scale of what the prisoners were about to witness tightened into a new kind of expectation. There would be steel sheds in shipyards, plants that produced everything from canned goods to complex aircraft parts. There would be farms where combines harvested acres in a single pass. There would be community acts of kindness that muddied the sharp edges of wartime enmity. The prisoners had, by then, been taught that the strength of a nation lies in its armies and its will. What they were beginning to see suggested an additional argument: that the material and organizational capacity to sustain wartime production, to feed millions, and to convert industry to war use was itself a form of power. It is here, the line between expectation and arrival, that our narrative pauses. From the deck of a Liberty ship, a prisoner could already see the outline of American piers breaking the horizon. From the lower berth of a Pullman car, the sudden stain of factory lights against the dark could be glimpsed between the slats of a freight car window. The question that had been murmured in secret by men like the diarist in Mexia, "They are not poor," was about to meet its loudest evidence. What would Norfolk look like, up close? How would the piers, the cranes, and the steady turnover of supplies land upon men who had been told otherwise for years? When the convoy changed course for the harbor, the whisper of that question became a press of expectation. The men tightened their jackets. They passed a last stretch of sea. Somewhere under the steady hum of electric lamps, it was beginning to feel like the beginning of something irreversible. If you like deep historical reveals, subscribe for more documentaries that dig beneath the headlines and into the unexpected human stories of World War II. The convoy eased into the harbor, and the prisoners watched the docks grow larger with each passing minute. For many, Norfolk was a revelation of scale that words alone could not carry. Cranes towered like skeletons of giants, piers ran for blocks, warehouses opened like mouths to receive an endless supply. One archival photograph, stamped with a U.S. Navy notation, shows a line of cargo bays gaping as forklifts carried pallet after pallet of canned food and boxed supplies. Prisoners who had crossed the Atlantic with only rumors to prepare them found themselves next to those piles of provision and their notebooks filled with bewildered shorthand. "They unloaded like a beehive," read an anonymous line in an undated diary excerpt kept in a War Department file. "They had men, machines, and something like a plan that never ended." The line is short, almost breathless, and it captures the way industrial organization presented itself, not as an abstract economy, but as a visible, functioning machine. For soldiers trained to read power in troop concentrations and armored thrusts, the sight of docks and logistic movement offered a different calculus. Strength measured not by a massing of guns, but by the capacity to move goods, men, and raw materials with relentless regularity. From Norfolk, the prisoners were loaded onto trains that threaded them through a nation whose evening lights looked like a map lit by 1,000 tiny lighthouses. The Pullman cars hummed and creaked. In the dining cars, waiters moved with practiced efficiency. Air conditioning, when it arrived in the compartments, was remarked upon with the same astonishment as a small miracle. Men who had not been inside functional passenger cars for months, if ever, felt the difference in their bones. The regularity of service, the predictability of schedules, the routines that turned transit into a civilized process rather than a scramble. Night after night on the rails, the same image recurred in diary margins: towns that were awake. Street lamps glowed, shop windows shone, gas stations were open, and the occasional diner sent out its smell of fried food into the passing darkness. "As if someone had switched on a grid across the whole country," wrote a soldier in a short, hurried scrawl preserved in a camp file, labeled simply "Train Diary." It was a phrase repeated by dozens of men in separate entries. Repetition hardened the anecdote into a pattern. The daylight view condensed the impression. Factories unfurled their roofs, pipes and chimney stacks making precise lines against the horizon. They were not silent relics. They breathed steam, scattered sparks, and exhaled humming energy into the air. Power lines stretched in tight ribbons, like arteries carrying current to a living organism composed of plants, warehouses, and homes. Grain elevators rose tall in prairie towns, their smooth silos gleaming in the sun. The scale of mechanization, combines that harvested acres in a single pass, elevators that moved grain with the efficiency of a clock, contrasted with the small, scattered holdings most prisoners had known back in Europe. The manpower of the American home front presented another surprising feature. Men and women worked side by side in many plants. Young people and older veterans mixed in the same queues. African Americans worked in industrial jobs at levels that varied regionally. And while segregation remained a bitter reality in much of the country, the sheer diversity of labor on display confounded simple expectations. Prisoners saw, in production lines and night shifts, a society marshaling human resources on a scale that was not solely military, but social and organizational. Assignment to camps brought men into the circuits of that productivity. The War Department's camp network was designed for labor allocation as much as detention. Records show camps located within striking distance of seasonal agricultural peaks and industrial plants that needed steady hands. Camp Hearn in Texas, a name that appears repeatedly in correspondence and inspection reports, became a typical example of the kind of place prisoners encountered. barracks of simple construction, mess halls with regulated menus, laundries, and latrine blocks that contrasted sharply with the improvisation of frontline quarters. A report from a camp inspector, clipped into a folder as Camp Hearn Inspection 1944, notes hot showers, flush toilets in certain blocks, and a camp hospital equipped to treat wounds and infectious diseases. Medicine surprised many prisoners. Penicillin, still relatively new in its widespread wartime use, appeared in camp hospitals to treat infections that in other eras might have become fatal. There are short, stark entries in medical logs that record inoculations, X-rays taken to check for pulmonary issues, and emergency treatments that were, by many accounts, applied with efficient professionalism. For soldiers who had faced long marches, poor sanitation at the front, and improvised field care, walking into a properly supplied infirmary where dressings were changed and antibiotics were administered felt like a privilege. And it was a display of the logistical depth behind American power. Work assignments ranged widely. Some prisoners went to farms, picking cotton, harvesting sugar beets, loading grain into elevators. Others found themselves in plants where the rhythm was relentless and the learning curve steep. Applying rivets, shaping aluminum parts, tending steam presses, or working on assembly lines for hulls and hull frames. Willow Run, for its massive B-24 bomber plant outside Detroit, became a destination for curiosity as much as labor. For many prisoners, the plant's reputation preceded it. Their diaries, once the novelty had settled and the details began to accumulate, recorded what the plant felt like. The roar of machines, the parade of thousands of parts arriving to be assembled, the precision of conveyors that coordinated hundreds of hands. At Willow Run, the scale was not merely about output, but about technique. The assembly line, already a symbol of American production since the Model T, had been adapted and intensified for wartime. Entire sequences, pressing, welding, riveting, inspection, were synchronized to move raw sheet metal into viable aircraft components with astonishing speed. One anonymous diary line, brief and grimly impressed, reads, "We thought our factories were good. They move here like an army of ants in a storm." An archivist's note attaches that phrase to a camp in Ohio, where Willow Run and other plants supplied components. Anecdote here becomes comparative evidence. German industrial care and discipline met American scale and modular logistics, and the two presented different models of production, each impressive in its own way, but not identical. Production was not simply the product of machines, it was the result of supply chains and resources. Aluminum plants, Alcoa among them, run on vast energy inputs, produced sheet after sheet for aircraft frames. Synthetic rubber plants converted petrochemical knowledge into tires, seals, and hoses that the motor of war required. Shipyards, from the Kaiser yards in the Pacific Northwest to the smaller yards along the Gulf, fed the convoys that kept material moving across oceans. Higgins Industries in New Orleans turned lumber and metal into small landing craft, Higgins boats, that became synonymous with amphibious assault capability. In every plant, the smell of hot metal, the sheen of oil, and the clatter of hammer and riveting gun told a story of an economy wired for scale. Prisoners who worked in those factories learned skills and saw production rhythms up close. They saw interchangeable parts treated as an organizing principle, the concept of fit achieved through process rather than artisanal judgment alone. Many observed the presence of women and younger workers in roles that in Germany might have been more gender segregated, and they recorded, with varying degrees of surprise and curiosity, how the workforce itself had been mobilized. For some, witnessing a woman riveter's skilled hands at Willow Run or a young mechanic's calm at a Ford line became one of those persistent images that would later be recounted to friends and relatives upon return. Agricultural work underscored the magnitude of American food production. In the Midwest and on the plains, combines harvested swaths of wheat and corn. Mechanized planters and combines transformed the seasonal calendar into a mechanical choreography. Grain elevators shipped storehouses of grain along railheads, and barges moved commodities down great river systems. One prisoner, working near a Nebraska grain elevator, recorded his astonishment in a single line that a camp librarian later copied into a collection: "Fields like seas, machines like nets." It is a poetic shorthand, but it points to the core experience. Agriculture here was scaled, systematized, and oriented to market supply in a way that many German soldiers had not imagined. Camp life itself presented a study in contrasts, beyond work assignments. Barracks, mess halls, and recreation halls became sites of acclamation. Camp libraries offered books in German and English. Camp newspapers, often produced with the help of the prisoners, published articles, poetry, and notices. Vocational training programs taught trades: carpentry, welding, mechanical repair. Some camps operated correspondence courses with American universities, allowing prisoners to continue or begin studies that might have been impossible at home. Enrollment figures vary from camp to camp, but wartime records and camp newsletters reported thousands of enrollments in educational programs across the network. One inspector's summary, prepared near the end of the war and filed under Camp Education 1945, lists dozens of technical courses taught informally by civilian instructors or educated prisoners. The camp hospitals deserve particular notice. Medical files indicate that X-rays were routine for those with respiratory complaints. Penicillin was used in more serious infections. Dental clinics were staffed to deal with chronic conditions. The presence of proper diagnosis and treatment, radiographs, sterile dressings, and the possibility of evacuation to better care when necessary was not universal across every camp. But where available, it solidified the impression that American logistical power could project care. One brief medical note preserved in a regional archive recounts an operation performed in a camp hospital to repair a compound fracture, completed with skill and followed by a course of antibiotics. To prisoners who had nursed injuries with field dressings and dubious supplies, seeing such procedures performed in a regulated environment was further proof that material abundance translated into human-level care. Humanity extended beyond medicine. Civic groups, church congregations, Boy Scout troops, and women's auxiliaries organized donations and packages. Christmas boxes in particular bore weight in letters and diaries. Neatly wrapped parcels containing chocolate, tobacco, socks, and canned goods annotated with notes in German and English. A camp commander's log records the arrival of community donations. Hundreds of boxes, sorted, cataloged, and distributed. These small acts were more than charity. They became bridge-building moments. Prisoners, often starved and weary, unwrapped familiar comforts and, more disarming, discovered that many American civilians viewed these men as human beings deserving of care, not merely enemy combatants. Italian service units, ISUs, present an instructive contrast in the larger narrative of POW labor and treatment. Italian prisoners, many of whom had been captured earlier, and who, after Italy's armistice, volunteered to serve in non-combatant units under U.S. supervision, performed tasks that ranged from hospital support to general maintenance. Their presence alongside American units offered German prisoners a live example of a different wartime posture. Those Italians who chose to cooperate often found themselves treated with a measure of freedom and respect that prefigured what some Germans would later also encounter, albeit under stricter rules. The ISUs were sometimes billeted separately, and their participation in support roles provided local communities with a chance to interact positively with former enemies. For German prisoners, the ISUs became an observational case. Loyalty, collaboration, and practical exchange could alter the contours of wartime identity. Work, education, and communal kindness combined into a pedagogical environment, but it was not an ideological school in the narrow sense. There were official re-education programs, often supported by the Army and by civilian organizations, designed to introduce democratic ideas, to discuss the ethics of totalitarian rule, and to provide instruction in civics and political thought. Camp newspapers and lecture series offered articles and talks about American institutions and wartime goals. Yet, the more persuasive teaching, according to many diaries and intelligence reports of the time, was the lived experience. The taste of food, the touch of stable shelter, the example of legal restraint and humane administration, and the practical lessons learned in factories and farms. Prisoner attitudes shifted along a gradient. Some remained staunch in their pre-war convictions, skeptical of every kindness and certain that American motives were purely strategic. Others, exposed to repeated acts of decency and to the relentless visual and tactile proof of production, found their certainties eroding. Camp interrogation reports, carefully redacted and produced by military intelligence, document that a significant number of prisoners showed signs of disillusionment with Nazi ideology after months in the camps. The intelligence files are careful not to overstate. They record gradations of opinion, guarded statements, and hesitant admissions. But they also record moments of clarity in which prisoners acknowledged that the enemy was not the hollow, deprived force they had been taught to picture. One practical example may be instructive. Workshops in some camps taught prisoners carpentry, engine repair, and other trades. A prisoner who learned to operate a drill press or to read blueprints in a makeshift vocational class often found, upon returning home, that the technical competence acquired in those months could be transferred to a peacetime economy. Camp administrators recorded thousands of hours of vocational instruction across the system. Those hours mattered. They were not the only factor that would shape post-war prospects, but they supplied skills that refugees of conflict could carry forward. The cumulative effect of work, education, and humane treatment began to produce qualitative changes. It is impossible to say with statistical certainty that every member of a cohort changed ideology, but the pattern is clear in contemporary sources. Letters home, post-war memoirs, and intelligence summaries reveal that many prisoners returned to Europe with questions where they had previously held certainties. An Army memo from late 1945, filed under re-education outcomes, notes that a measurable number of POWs renounced previous allegiances and expressed interest in democratic ideas or in rebuilding rather than renewing conflict. The memo is cautious, using phrases such as a notable minority or a significant number, language that preserves the nuance demanded by historical method. When prisoners returned to Germany after the war, some of those who had been allocated to American camps carried more than scars and memories. They brought skills, technical knowledge, and, in a modest but meaningful way, relationships. Few, if any, historians argue that POW experience caused the Wirtschaftswunder, the West German economic miracle. Reconstruction was a complex process shaped by Marshall Plan aid, institutional reforms, currency stabilization, labor policies, the persistence and skill of German entrepreneurs and workers, and the geopolitical necessities of the emerging Cold War. Yet, the lived exposure of thousands who had seen American production techniques, experienced vocational training, and witnessed functioning civic institutions fed into a larger reservoir of human capital and practical know-how that would be tapped in Reconstruction. Consider a mid-level machine operator who returned to a ruined town with a sketch of an assembly method learned in Ohio. Or a former POW who had worked at an aluminum plant and later helped reopen or retool a facility in the Ruhr. These were not singular causal chains, but threads woven into the broader tapestry of recovery. The returnees were carriers of technical detail, attitudinal modification, and personal testimony about American capabilities and about the possibility of a different political life. In some towns, ex-POWs found themselves consulted by local businesses for practical advice. In others, they joined unions that would shape labor relations in the new Federal Republic. Personal reunions and post-war correspondence offer human vignettes that underline this transfer. In a series of letters preserved by a regional archive, an unnamed former POW describes writing back to an American supervisor who had shown him kindness in a factory in 1944. Decades later, the same man would travel with a passport and a desire for reconciliation to see the person who had given him a second-hand work glove and a bit of American advice on machining tolerances. These are human stories, micro-histories that historians have used to argue for a cultural and technical exchange that was real, if not determinative. The process of ideological collapse did not happen uniformly or instantly. Some men returned bitter and resentful, convinced their captors had used comfort as a form of manipulation. Others returned curious or open, willing to test new ideas. Yet, what is striking in the archival record is the consistency of certain images: electric lights, moving lines of production, hot showers, libraries, and a steady supply of food. Over time, those images entered the cultural memory of returning soldiers, and through them, the communities that rebuilt Germany. The impression that America could not be dismissed as weak or decadent, an impression formed in months of rail travel, factory shifts, and communal evenings, was perhaps the most durable political lesson veterans carried home. To capture this broader legacy, historians must balance anecdote with caution. The prison camp experience was one influence among many. Policy, economic aid, institutional reform, and the resilience of German society played the largest roles. Still, personal testimony and quantitative indicators combined to make a persuasive case that the POW experience nudged beliefs and supplied practical skill at a critical historical juncture. Camp records indicate not only the presence of educational and vocational programs, but their popularity. Thousands of prisoners took part in classes and workshops, according to wartime U.S. Army records and camp newsletters. Local American communities kept correspondence with camps. Missionaries and civic groups exchanged letters with former prisoners after the war. Some communities even hosted visits years later. The human element of these bonds cannot be overstated. During the holidays, community groups organized concerts and shared tables. One camp newsletter reproduced, in translation, a German hymn sung at a Christmas service, accompanied by the note that church choirs from the local town had performed and shared carols in both languages. The image is small, a choir under a makeshift stage, but it matters for what it represents: the ordinary, painstaking work of human connection that breaks down the caricatures wartime propaganda had created. The Italian service units visited communities in more expansive roles, and their interactions sometimes served as a template for later exchanges involving German prisoners and local civilians. There were also moments of confrontation with the darker realities of the war. Some prisoners during transfers or in liberated areas confronted footage or evidence of concentration camps and the industrialized atrocity of the Holocaust. These encounters were often brief and searing. Prisoners who had imagined the war in terms of national pride and martial duty faced undeniable evidence of crimes that could not be ignored. Archives contained sparse but poignant reactions, entries labeled indefinido, where diarists later scratched out names or wrote haltingly about scenes they had seen. The historical duty here is to treat these moments with solemnness. They were not mere plot devices in the American pedagogical program. They confronted prisoners with moral questions that sometimes accelerated their disillusionment with the regime. As the war wound down and the camps emptied, some former prisoners elected to remain in the United States, marrying into communities or seeking opportunities that war-ravaged Europe could not offer immediately. Others returned and became part of the workforce that rebuilt German industry, carrying ideas about mass production, workforce organization, and even consumer habits. Again, the causal claims are modest. These were contributions among many, not the singular engine of recovery. Yet, they were real threads in the post-war fabric. The story of reunions and remembrance offers the final emotional chord in this narrative. In the decades that followed, former prisoners and American civilians sometimes met again in gestures of reconciliation. A reunion in 1985, documented in a local paper and in private collections, brought together former camp administrators, local volunteers, and a handful of ex-POWs who had returned for the occasion. They spoke of small kindnesses, of packages that had meant more than the items they contained, and of the slow, awkward work of coming to terms with the past. These meetings were not erasures of wartime harm, but rather efforts to acknowledge a complicated human history. Adversaries made human by comfort, compassion, and the demonstration of industriousness. What then did German POWs discover about America's unmatched industrial power? The answer must be layered. They discovered a nation whose production capacity was visible in docks and cranes, in rolling trains and lit towns, in plants that turned out planes and boats, in farms harvested by machines, and in hospitals where infections were treated with medicines that had scarcely been available at the front. They discovered institutional competence, logistic systems capable of moving food, fuel, and parts across oceans, and social mobilization on a grand scale. They discovered examples of humane treatment that contradicted wartime caricature. And they discovered in the cumulative effect of these experiences a practical argument against the notion that material abundance correlated with moral inferiority or decadence. The demonstration effect was neither uniform nor absolute, but it was persuasive. The visible, lived evidence of a nation's productive capacity, combined with humane administration and vocational engagement, taught lessons that leaflets and broadcasts could rarely match. An experience felt in the body, hot water, a full meal, a steady paycheck, the steady light of a factory at night was harder to dismiss than a speech. It translated into technical knowledge for some, attitudinal change for others, and a lasting human awareness for many. In the end, historians return to a cautious conclusion. The POW experience was one of multiple factors that contributed to the post-war shape of Europe. It was not the simple cause of any single outcome, but it was part of a set of human interactions, material transfers, and institutional displays that reshaped perceptions. American industrial power was made tangible for those who had once regarded the United States as weak or decadent. That tangibility, seen in the dock cranes of Norfolk, felt in the steel forging heat of plants, tasted in communal tables, and learned in vocational shops, left traces on the men who saw it and on the societies they would help to reconstruct. If this film leaves a single sober insight, it is this. Material abundance, organized into coherent systems of production and care, is a political argument made more convincingly by lived experience than by theory alone. For thousands of German soldiers, the American interior functioned as a vast classroom, teaching by example what political rhetoric could not quite reach. Whether those lessons translated into specific economic outcomes is a matter for broader study. But as a human story, the testimony is clear. When men were shown a different model of national life, many of them changed the way they thought about their own. If you found this episode revealing, watch our next feature exploring the arsenal of democracy and the factories that turned peacetime industries into wartime lifelines. There are more stories in the stacks, of ships built in record time, of workers who learned new trades, and of communities that chose generosity over vengeance.